Hello, I'm Peter Corr. Welcome to Rejoin Rants.
Hi, I'm Lisa Burton. Thanks for joining us. And tonight we have a great guest, Phil Moorhouse.
Rejoin.
Phil, would you like to introduce yourself for our listeners, please?
Yeah, my name's Phil. I was a teacher for a long time and used to just sort of talk about politics in the staff room, friends, things like that. And then I started doing politics online on YouTube on a different bias channel. And this coincided with a lot of things going crazy in UK politics, but particularly driven by Brexit. So I built a channel largely talking about, British politics, a focus on like Westminster politics, but always behind it is this idea of Brexit, which has fundamentally changed politics in this country to the point where it's quite a different beast nowadays.
Come and join us on Saturday the 28th of September for the Rejoin March. Tell everyone you know to remember. We're gonna tell to stop ignoring the will of the people, because Brexit is nothing but a load of fecal.
Certainly is. And you've got nearly 200,000 followers on YouTube, is that right?
Yes, not far off yet. Not far off.
Excellent.
Massive, isn't it? Is it the same channel you had when you was gaming, or is it a
No, it's a different channel, that one. I have not done anything. In fact, recently, ironically, YouTube have just said, yeah, we're going to stop monetizing that channel now because you don't seem to be doing anything on it, which I'm not. Right. So that one fell by the wayside. Ultimately, it started, the political one started, because I've always been interested in politics from like a stupidly young age. Because when I was growing up in the 80s, I used to watch Spitting Image and Yes Minister and things like that. So I was, I was growing up in a mining village in the 80s as well. So politics was everywhere, and I was very interested in it. I even had a computer game where you could be the Prime Minister. I was always kicked out after a year after the election because I would because as it turns out, a 6-year-old isn't very, or an 8-year-old, isn't very good at running the economy.
I bet it didn't better than Boris Johnson.
Well, maybe, but I used to stoke hyperinflation, and then there'd be a vote of no confidence, and I'd be kicked out for about a year or year and a half. So I was never any good at it, but I was very interested. But in terms of YouTube, I started doing something on a gaming channel. And then the game I played, I had to cut back on because of work, which is often the way. But then after that point, because I had been using YouTube as a sort of a vehicle for it. And then I decided I quite liked doing YouTube. So I just needed another outlet for it. And I knew that talking about politics is something, because I'd already been doing it for decades, to anyone who would listen, it's the sort of thing I could do for the rest of my life if people want to listen to it. So it became a natural thing to do. But when I started the channel, it wasn't really just about politics. It was politics and current affairs and all, and even a bit of social commentary. But I've since decided I'm not very good at the social commentary. So I started the channel in 2018, but by the end of 2018, because it was aimless, I didn't know what I was doing really. But by the end of 2018, I knew that Brexit, because this was the time where Theresa May had her deal, sort of that there was the Chequers meeting, but it looked like she wouldn't be able to get the support of her own party. And you sort of had this feeling that politics was going to fundamentally break in 2019. So I thought, right at the end of 2018, I thought to myself, right, I'm going to do politics content. I'm going to do regular content, like everyday type content. and I'm going to build the channel up because we're going to be entering some very, very strange times, because Brexit was breaking the Conservative Party, and it was breaking the Labour Party, and it was just completely it was tilting everything. There was normally politics would be about one particular party in government wants to do. They have various policies. They want to do this. In terms of the Conservatives, it's like, small state, private enterprise type stuff. Labour is a bit more, more regulation, more sort of state control of things, even if not state owned all the time. But that's the preference. And that's supposed to be the difference. But then what we had is there was no government. Every policy had to be seen through the eyes of Brexit. Everything was taken over Brexit. Civil servants were being diverted to Brexit-related matters. So the job of government simply wasn't happening. And you could see this going on, and you knew where it was going to head. So, yeah, I just, end of 2018, I thought, well, there's going to be a lot of mileage in this. But even as 2019 rumbled on, every time I hit a new milestone of subscribers, I would say to followers, there's going to come a time when politics will normalise, and I'm not sure it'll be that crazy. I'm not sure how many views we'll be getting. And you can see that now a little bit with the new government, because whenever I do a video on what the government's doing, it doesn't get anywhere near as many views because it's not really crazy. And yet the politics still is, because everything is still seen through this prism of Brexit. So if you want to talk about, one of the big things at the moment is we're looking forward to, well, not looking forward to, but we're looking ahead to Rachel Reeves's first budget, where the focus is on this budget black hole, trying to find effectively tens of billions of pounds that isn't there. It's just to maintain spending, let alone pay for the extra spending that Labour have promised in the manifesto. And literally anyone can go, well, if we were still in the EU, we'd have tens of billions of pounds more in tax revenues from customs duties, which we're currently just waving through. And we would have more trade than we otherwise would have, easier trade. Or the businesses that are still conducting that trade would have lower costs because they're not having to pay for ridiculous things like paperwork or extra costs of transport, because it's literally taking longer to get things there. So they would be making more profits, which means more taxes go into the Treasury. So, everything has a Brexit dimension these days. And, in terms of the NHS, it's not just about funding. There's medicine shortages. Anyone who, will know about this, you can sometimes go to the pharmacy, they've got shortages. And before, when we were in the EU, sometimes there would be. You're typically, just like France now, you would typically have about 20 drugs where we'd have a shortage, some blockage in the supply chain. But nowadays in Britain, it's more like 160 at any one time shortages. And that is because of our exit from the single market and the fact that there's now these huge trade barriers in the way that make it more difficult to get things at short notice, because we can't just order things in. We can't just go, oh, it used to take 2 days to get this, now it takes 3 weeks. So we'll order it 3 weeks in advance. Supply chains can't work like that, because first of all, the cash flow may not allow for that. And also your storage may not allow for it. And when you're talking about drugs, they go off. So like food,
it goes off. Crazy. It's crazy. But like you say, no one's talking about the economy and Brexit and putting it together, and Labour avoiding that like the plague. Not at one point have they said Brexit has really hurt our economy. They haven't been honest about that as such. They just kind of like go around the edges of that kind of commentary and don't address it. And I suppose that's why we're having the National Rejoin March, Peter? Just to kind of keep that message at the forefront.
I think that we've clearly definitely got a way more grown-up government now, and a lot of the crazy from government has gone away, and we know that a massive majority of Labour members and Labour voters are pro-European, pro-EU even. Some people are saying, well, should we be having a march so soon? I think yes. I think we have to keep vocal. We have to keep vocal for as long as it takes. I think. When I say as long as it takes as well, I think no one's under an impression that we can apply to rejoin the EU tomorrow and be in the EU a week on Friday. Do you know what I mean? But if it's going to take years for it to happen, then the start of that years needs to be now, in my opinion, not give it 5 years and then start it. Do you know what I mean? Because it might, well, I don't know. I just feel that, especially with you on, Phil, because I know you're a big Labour guy, that I would like to know what you think we should do about Labour, and in terms of specifically PR and rejoin the EU.
So in terms of Labour, it's, you know, I agree. There needs to be a conversation now. If we had a media that were having this conversation, I would say, well, you know, then the conversation is happening already. But the media are not driving this conversation. You know, as Lisa's just said there, Labour don't want to talk about how Brexit has damaged the economy. They talk about how the Tory Brexit deal has damaged it. They like that because that's good party politics. So they blame it on the weak or the thin, I think Keir Starmer uses the word thin, Tory deal, suggesting a better deal. Well, a better deal obviously would be better, but still, it's... but from Labour's point of view, I mean, the leaders we have now are all very pro-EU. And Labour they're facing the right direction now. The Conservatives before, even though you thought they sort of softened their stance a little bit under Rishi Sunak with the Windsor Framework, that was not progress. That was just stopping going further in the wrong direction, because the consequence of not settling the Northern Ireland Protocol was a trade war. And we've still got a hang up from that, because just because we've agreed these adjustments with the Windsor Framework, we still haven't implemented it. So in terms of getting deals with the EU, whether it's big or small, the EU have recently said, you need to actually implement the agreements you've already signed with us before, because why should we consider other agreements when you haven't actually complied with the other ones? Because at the moment, we are seen as a bad faith actor, and we could look at it and go, well, look, you know, the people in charge of the government now are very pro-EU, and they're explicitly wanting a closer relationship on any policy area you can name. Energy, defence, security in general, trade, foreign affairs in general, in terms of like our shared views. I mean, Keir Starmer just put out a common press release with Schultz and Macron recently regarding the Middle East. So they're very keen to be closer to Europe on absolutely everything. So the direction is now fine. The Conservatives, their direction was all about, it was divergent. So it was moving away from the EU. And they were just trying to work out a way to do it, like they have been since 2016. Ever since they got the Brexit referendum result, they thought, oh no, so we now need to leave the EU. How can we do it in the least damaging way possible? Which, as it turned out, they decided to do it in the most damaging way possible.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that was what they were antagonising over. How can we do this thing in a way that doesn't split our party in the least damaging way possible? And they were never able to solve that. Whereas with Labour, they don't damage the party at all, being very pro-EU. They can be openly pro-EU. The problems are on the EU and the UK side. On the UK side, a lot of people got very damaged relationships out of Brexit. It broke up like some family and friendship relationships, and people don't want another toxic Brexit debate. The second problem is people still have this hang up about freedom of movement as if it's a bad thing, even while they're queued up for days trying to go on holiday, you know, because people don't really understand. You know, if you can try and talk to someone and say, give me a practical problem with freedom of movement with Europe, I've yet to find someone who's able to say something to me that was a problem when we had this freedom of movement.
Bloody immigrants coming over here, innit?
But I mean, that was the thing. They very clearly highlighted, you know, Nigel Farage and his cronies very clearly highlighted immigrants from outside of Europe.
Turkey.
Which inevitably were going to go up and have gone up after closing freedom of movement with Europe. So, you know, there's a huge disconnect. I mean, there was just a slightly different thing in terms of generally speaking, Britain's attitude to immigration. So there's a few polls that are really interesting. So on YouGov, for example, it's the same pollster. The latest figures on YouGov say that 66% of people think immigration is too high in Britain. Okay. But there was another question posed to people. So it was noting that because of a policy the Conservatives put in place last year, there's been an 82%, it's massive, 82% reduction in foreign workers applying to work in health and care jobs in the UK. So that's like the NHS, care homes, things like that. An 82% reduction. And it asked respondents, is this a positive thing or a negative thing? 64% said this is a negative thing. This is a bad thing. So you've got 66% are saying immigration's too high. So then you say, oh, then great news, because this massive source of immigration, you know, the health and care sector is down by 82%. And they go, no, that's really bad. So there's this huge disconnect with people. They sort of in general think immigration's too high, probably because they've been told so by the media.
Two stats just don't make sense.
No, they don't.
Do they?
Because when you point out the individual components that make up immigration, no one really, well, not no one, but a majority don't really think it is too high. Oh, so is it bad, you know, when we've got shortages in care homes in the NHS, is it bad that foreign workers come here to fill those in? Well, no. Refugees. Oh, well, as long as they're genuine refugees, we're fine. Well, that's okay, because we've processed them. The non-genuine ones get deported. You know, so whenever you sort of point to university students, like who's mad enough to say we don't want more foreign students who basically spend a load of money and then at the end of it, they have no rights to stay here. They just come, they're like tourists. They come here like they're on a massive holiday, except it's to study. They subsidise university courses for British students who, you know, many of these courses cannot run on British students alone. And they come over here and they, you know, spend a load of money. Who wants to reduce that? And yet we have done. And now as a result of that, there's going to be a load of British jobs lost in the university sector and a load of British students who are not going to be able to study those courses because those courses are collapsing due to the lack of funds. And our government's not going to pay more for British students to study those courses.
No. No chance.
It's the same in my sector, logistics. I'm a lorry driver, and most other lorry drivers I speak to, I avoid speaking to them nowadays, to be honest, because they're often anti-immigration, on the far right, I would say, reform voters like Farage, like Robinson, etc., etc. So they was all for Brexit. And it happened, and we lost tens of thousands of workers in our sector that used to come from the EU. A big reason was the clogging up at Dover all the time, because a lot of European countries pay their lorry drivers by the kilometre rather than by the hour like we are. So when they're sat there at Dover for 3 days, they're literally not getting paid to sit there to do it. So they was just refusing to come over, and other ones were refusing to come over to work. And now there's a worldwide shortage of lorry drivers, but I think the world is at just about coping levels, and the UK was at just about coping levels. But when we pulled out the single market, we are no longer at coping levels when it comes to logistics, and drivers are on the arse. We're run ragged, I tell you, and we ain't getting no more money for it. The wages increased 3 times since Brexit, yeah, but every time was not as much as inflation went up by. It's a massive con. The entire thing is a massive con.
And on the immigration front, is the rhetoric. So last year, like you were saying, the Tories changed the bills again and stuff like that about dependents, and they ask for these people to come in, and then they make this rhetoric around that. Say, okay, we're going to cut those positions because people bring dependents, and they make it out like these dependents are a drain on the state, and they're not. So if you come as a dependent, one, you have to be a spouse or a child under the age of 18. And you are not allowed to claim any benefits if you are on a dependent's visa. Now, you can go and work, I believe, and get a job, but you cannot claim any benefits. So even migrants who are bringing a family member, say a doctor with a wife, etc., they are not putting any burden on the state. But the way the Tories put this across was like these dependents are dependent on the state. And of course, that's put a lot of people off as well, applying for jobs, particularly, in the NHS and care sector. Whereas when we were in the EU, a lot of young people filled those positions, and they would just move organically backwards and forwards. Their families are much closer by. Their families are in very similar economic situation. So they don't have that desire to have to bring a family member with them for support, etc., etc. And it's just the rhetoric. I just don't know how we're ever going to start unraveling all the damage that has been done by that Tory rhetoric and to change the narrative, because Labour really need to get off the blocks here and start talking positively about migrants. They make 20% of the British workforce up. Try doing without them. And like someone today, I can't remember who it was, but a prominent Brexiteer, I think it was in GB News, was complaining that more job creation had been given to, I think, Nigerians and Indians than British people in the last 5 years. Well, yes, because you don't have the British people to take up those jobs. So what are you going to do,
I mean, this is the thing. The Conservatives spent all these years going, unemployment's really low. So what you mean is we don't really have many British workers to fill the unfilled positions then. That's what you're saying. So what do we do? If you've got a business that has let's say it's got 50 positions, but they're all really important, and you can't fill 5 of them up, that means your business can't function. So you're basically saying, well, the business should fail and 45 people lose their jobs because you don't want to hire 5 people from abroad. That is the nonsense of it.
I'll tell you what they do. It is, again, exactly what they've done in our sector. Well, at least the Tories did this. Hopefully Labour will not start doing this. I can't imagine the unions let Labour get away with this. But when they realised there was such a massive shortage for drivers, what they did is they took our workers' rights away from us, but made it sound like a good idea. So they said, we'll let you drivers drive for 11 hours on certain contracts. We'll let 18-year-olds pass the test now, which in my eyes, as a lorry driver, is like, oh yeah, thanks, make the fucking roads more unsafe for me all day, every day. Cheers. That's what they do.
Did they also write to everyone in the country who had a HGV license from years and years ago? Yeah, my ex-husband, who got one years and years and years ago, he got a letter offering him to take up a position.
Claire got a license in the army when she was 20. She's 44 now. She got one of them letters saying, you've got a HGV license, do you want to go and work for Tesco's? Fuck off.
They started off as well, Boris Johnson started off, because as they always do, the market will provide. So when it was pointed out, not just the lack of drivers, but the lack of facilities we have in this country for lorry drivers. And it was just say, well, the private sector will provide them. The private sector said, no, we won't. Yeah, they'll provide it if they can make a profit out of it.
Yeah,
the government's supposed to provide everything else. So he was coming on the point, well, yeah, we need these facilities, so they should build them and they should train more lorry drivers. It's like, well, they'll train as many lorry drivers as they think is in their interest. If that's not enough for the country, that's the government's job to coordinate that. But the Conservatives didn't see it as that. Whereas at least with Labour, they do see the role of the government as being to manage things. So if there's a shortage of something, they do see it as their job. Whether it is going to be the public or private sector that provides, the extra supply of whatever it is you're talking about, they do at least see it as their job to drive that. So
Can I just say how funny it is that we're applauding the government because they're doing the most bare minimum of, well, at least they know they are there to run the country.
I mean, that's what we have in this country. We don't have a shift between two types of government that just disagree. We have between a government that thinks it should run the country and one that thinks it should stop anyone else. They're seat blockers. The Conservatives are seat blockers. They're there to stop other people running the country. And yet, ironically, they have introduced the most interventionist policy, in living memory, in terms of Brexit, because now everything has to be seen through that, every single policy. I mean, one thing I would, in terms of conversations with Labour, one thing I would like people to really press Labour on, we have never, in terms of getting because I understand the political position. Labour don't want to talk about Brexit being damaging, just the Tory Brexit being damaging. I get that. But one thing we've never had is an economic impact assessment for Brexit. You have an impact assessment for absolutely everything. Any policy you have which will have or is likely to have an economic impact, you have the Treasury the Treasury economists work out how it's likely to affect GDP. We've had it for the Brexit trade deals, which have all shown that actually this isn't going to do anything for our economy. It's always lauded in the Daily Express, but when you read the actual government's own economic impact assessment report, it says, yeah, this might give us 3 pence in 30 years. it might actually reduce. Some of the actual trade deal economic impact assessment reports from the government have said this deal is actually quite likely to reduce our GDP compared to not having a deal, which is a bit mad. It just shows how weak those deals are. We could easily have done without them, because that's the main selling point of Brexit as well, being outside the single market means we can strike our own trade deals. Well, the trade deals we have so far are either worthless or worth less than nothing. They're actually harmful in some cases. They're basically worth zero, give or take a tiny proportion of our GDP. So we've literally got
the Australians laughing in our faces on the news.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. How far do you think this active realignment will go, Phil? You know, this kind of deal that they want, you know, product safety and is it metrology or something like Bill, to ensure that the standards stay the same along with the EU standards. I mean, at least it's something positive for businesses and exporters and importers. But how much effect do you think that will actually have on customs coming in and out and things like that, and paperwork?
Quite limited, because the problem we have with customs, we have, in theory, customs controls. So all the honest businesses around the world and in the EU will be filling in their customs paperwork very dutifully. However, there are two main problems. First of all, they could be making errors and no one really know, because HMRC said right from the start, 2021, when we, a year late, brought those in, that they're going to prioritise traffic flow over compliance, because what we can't afford is to have we can't afford Soviet-era shortages on the shelves. So no one's really checking them, or not checking enough of them. So there could be mistakes being made, which means we could be missing out on tax revenues that way. But then there's the smugglers, the ones who just go, do you know what, when traffic flow's high, we're just going to send our lorries through. And what we've had in the last couple of years, we've had some news stories of record hauls, and you think, oh, well, they're finding them, that's great. You have a lorry full of illicit cigarettes, absolutely jam-packed, and you think, well, that's great, they found them. It's not great, because what it means is they didn't bother to hide them. It means the reason they're record hauls is because they used to try and hide them in amongst stock in the back of that lorry or freight for which the paperwork did match, and you just hoped they didn't find the crates that had the illicit stuff in it. Now they're just filling the lorries up because they're confident that they'll just sail through. No one's going to check them as long as they do it at a time where they can't afford to because of traffic flow. So we're getting a lot of stuff coming into the country where what is in the back of the lorry is not what the paper says it is, which means we're missing. This is why we're missing out on tens of billions of pounds in customs revenues. And with the standards controls, our standards controls are much weaker than they should be, but we have now started to bring them in. But if we couldn't actually manage customs controls properly, how are we supposed to manage customs and standards checks? We can't. So we're doing the same thing with standards checks, almost no checking. In fact, some of these nice shiny facilities that have been built around Dover, or just in Kent in general, because like at least one of them is like 20 miles inland. Good luck making sure the lorry definitely goes there on the way. And it's they're complaining that they're getting no business. They built these things at great cost, but they're not able to recoup that cost because the government said, we can't be bothered to actually check them. So we're still not checking, which means we're still wide open to something. I mean, we already know from some random checks that dangerously unfit for consumption foods coming in. And you combine that with a cost of living crisis where some people can't afford to eat properly. Of course, they're going to buy food from, if someone can sell it really cheap, dodgy dealer, they will, but it's dangerous. But also with a large chance of importing a dangerous animal disease, and that could wipe out a whole section of our sector. And then if that happens, you imagine what would happen if we had another BSE type crisis. It would be worse than the BSE crisis because we're now, obviously exports of that were stopped anyway, even though we're in the EU, because the EU can still protect itself against one part of the EU that has a problem. But now we have a particular problem in that we can't even verify that the stuff we produce ourselves is fit for our own market, because like everything else, the network of laboratories that test for food safety is Europe-wide. And under those circumstances, we wouldn't be allowed to send samples of that food to a laboratory in Germany, because it's like, well, no, anything from that sector, if it gets tainted, you can't send to the EU. But it's like, well, we're just sending it for testing. We don't care. it'll be a block on it. So we won't even be able to test for our own market. So it would be much more harmful now if we had something like that. And yet we're still open to it. So we have this weird situation. So the government, whether it was the Conservative or the Labour government, the government needs to ramp up those checks for two reasons. First of all, because we're losing a lot of money and we're opening ourselves up to risk. But also, if we want the EU to agree a better trade deal later on, we need leverage. Our leverage is applying trade barriers to EU businesses. So the more those trade barriers by EU businesses, the more they will say to the EU Commission, we want a closer deal now. The downside is if we do that, we stretch our supply chains even more. We have more shortages of things that, have a limited shelf life go off much more quickly. So it's a real dilemma, and it's not an easy one to fix, which is why Labour want to they have this idea of, they want the veterinary agreement, which means that for certain products, like animal-based products, they can they know that outside the single market paperwork is still needed, but they are hoping to at least reduce the checks. Can we just get rid of it and start to pick away at trade barriers like that? So the paperwork would still be needed, but can we get an agreement that would mean the checks are not needed, or at least the vast majority of checks are not needed? Because if the vast majority of checks are not needed, then you don't need so many vets, and you don't have as much delays, and you don't have as much costs for those businesses as well. And I think that's what it's a case of doing. But whether they can is another matter, because if you want a veterinary agreement that basically eliminates checks, then you're saying alignment of standards with the EU, which is actually easy. Keir Starmer has said he's got no problem with that at all. So that's politically easy for Labour. They've already indicated that they're more than happy to do that. And as Lisa said in the King's speech, there was a bill that allows ministers to do that. The other side of it, though, is, so that sounds really easy, but then the other side of it is at some point there will be a dispute between businesses. And because you're talking about EU rules, you're talking about the European Court of Justice having oversight. I don't actually know what Labour think about that. Is that a political hot potato for them or not? I've actually read recently 2 EU policy experts. One thinks it will be an issue for Labour. One thinks it won't. I don't know, because they haven't said anything. Because that's the problem. When they don't talk about a thing, you don't know what they're actually thinking.
Well, they've committed to the ECHR, so you would think they would commit to the ECJ, wouldn't you? You would.
I don't know. I think we have this weird thing in this country that people have a fundamentally different attitude to the EU and literally every other international organisation we're part of. Like, you can have Rishi Sunak say, "Oh, well, and he treats it as if you're simple for saying, why are you saying the European Court of Human Rights is a foreign court? Look, it's located in a foreign country. Well, the UN's located in a foreign country. Is the UN foreign? NATO's located in another country. Is the NATO foreign?" But no one asks him those follow-up questions. But it is literally the case. The Conservatives treat the Council of Europe and the EU as fundamentally different to literally everything else. But just in terms of the country, there's this fundamentally different attitude to the EU and literally every other international organisation that most people wouldn't even countenance leaving.
And haven't we just joined that transatlantic cooperation deal, which was an already established thing with its own already established rules, which we now have to follow.
Yes,
that weren't written by us. Yeah. I mean, so we clearly can go and do that, and the Tories did that without even a referendum. So
this is sovereignty, isn't it? Brexit is all about sovereignty. It's all about sovereignty. Well, you give a little bit of sovereignty up in every deal. It's give and take, it's compromise. You're sharing a small part of sovereignty in every deal, including CPTPP, and so it's a crazy situation.
This is what I was going to ask about, is how to sell Rejoin to the voters, Phil. Because I think there's two, whenever I say Rejoin, the biggest things that I get back from people who either want to argue or certainly wouldn't want to rejoin is the euro currency, and freedom of movement. Now, to me, both of them things are positive, and I believe, for example, the euro currency, I always say back to them, when you're looking at your app to see how much money is in your bank, what are you looking at, the number or the symbol in front of it? And if you're looking at the number and wondering what you can buy with it, what does it matter what currency it is? That's what I say to people, and that normally gets a good response. It's really simple. That's because I'm
and the other thing is, given that a lot of what they're buying with it anyway, even if they're buying it in this country, has been bought by someone in euros, then in actual fact, if you like, there are actually arguments for not giving up the pound. But at the end of the day, if that's what we had to do to join the EU, the benefits outweigh. But, if you're talking about from a consumer's point of view, there were extra costs in using different currencies, because the person who sold us, the tomatoes from Spain, they were selling it to us in euros. We may have been buying it in pounds from our point of view, but they've been selling it in euros. So if you have one currency, then it's easier to know what you're dealing with anyway for everyone involved in the supply chain. And also, just in a simple thing, when you're traveling abroad, it's all the same currency. You don't have to give out, you're not giving away anything in fees or anything like that for currency exchange, and you're familiar with it. And you still get your own currency notes. If we want a picture of King Charles on them, that could, because every country has its own euro notes anyway, that puts its own designs on.
Am I right in thinking we had a referendum on joining the euro when Blair was Prime Minister?
No. They decided, Gordon Brown really decided, he said it's always 5 tests in politics. He said, I've got 5 tests. I just think he didn't want to join, because you can come up with 5 tests that will allow you to join or not as you like.
Anything.
I think in reality, there are, the main reason not to is because you then lose control of monetary policy. Now, for you and I, that doesn't matter because we don't decide monetary policy. In theory, the government don't either, because that's the Bank of England, but the government lean heavily on the Bank of England. So they don't want to give up that control. And that was the case for Labour as well.
Why?
Well, it's like as politicians exist for control. People become politicians. People become senior politicians because they want to control policies. So the idea of giving it up. So it's really politicians who don't like giving up control. It's not you or I who don't decide these things anyway. When Brexit said take back control, they weren't talking about us. We got no extra control out of it at all.
That's a bit like, isn't it, how governments will have a fight with another government and they'll decide it's so bad they're going to have a war, but they won't fight each other. They'll just send all the kids in.
Exactly. So
do you think, Phil, that do you think that we should go for PR?
Yes.
Do you think the EU would want us to have proportional representation before they would seriously look at us as partners again if we were particularly stable, which of course we're not at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the stability side of it is simply, at the moment, the instability is because at the very next election, as far as anyone can tell, it's always the case that the Conservatives could come back to power. And while ever the Conservatives are saying, whatever you try and negotiate with the EU, beyond certain things, we will rip up. So we saw Labour are fairly safe trying to improve better deals. The Conservatives are not. They're not. If we get a veterinary deal, the Conservatives won't complain about that. But if we try and join the customs union, people talk about the single market, realistically, that's actually harder to do than join the EU. It's easier to join the EU than the single market because there's no mechanism for that at the moment.
I want to ask you about that actually in a minute. Yeah.
But let's say we went for the big one and joined the EU. As long as the Conservatives are saying, well, we'll win the next election and then just scrap the whole thing, it's not worth the EU's time even thinking about it. And at the moment, they still have this attitude that we can't be trusted anyway until we can prove we can be trusted by, for example, complying with the agreements we already have, which we haven't done. We haven't complied with the Northern Ireland Protocol / Windsor Framework yet. There's lots of things we haven't complied with yet that we still need to implement.
Including citizens' rights for EU migrants, which is a big one. Yeah.
Obviously, the EU are, the EU Commission are politicians themselves. They can't be seen to countenance further deals while their own citizens are being mistreated in this third country. That's not a great look. So, there's lots of ththings we still need to do, some of which could be done more quickly than others. Anything related to Northern Ireland, though, is inevitably trickier. But joining the EU, it's just like, even if we'd repaired our relationship, which isn't going to happen overnight, even if we repaired our relationship, the EU will still say, well, the people who might come in a few years' time, it takes a long time to join the EU, and the people who are the alternative and could well win the next election, say they will scrap it. It's not worth our time. They've got other things to be dealing with, like, for example, a war in Europe and working out what to do about competition with China, working out what to do if the Americans vote for Trump this autumn, working out how to maintain momentum with, the climate emergency. There's lots of things they need to do for which there are difficult but achievable solutions that they can work on long time. Talking to the UK about joining the EU, it's like, we could talk to you, we could spend a lot of effort on you. Another election comes along, the Tories come in and says, deal's off, we're finished.
See, I've heard that before, right? And please do correct me, Phil, because you're way more knowledgeable than I am, that's for sure. But isn't it the case that there are countries already trying to join the EU now for, there's stuff with Ukraine going on, Turkey and some others, aren't there? So there's basically must be a team within the EU whose job it is to be dealing with that. So when people say, well, they're too busy doing climate, they're too busy doing this, well, if that's the case, surely those countries wouldn't be making progress in joining?
No, although it is the case that there will be officials who will work day to day on that, you'd need extra officials. It's still the EU Commission that have to make the sort of executive decisions, and they have to do it in concert with everyone. Because, the EU Commission, although they sort of decide policy directions, they also have to take soundings, because ultimately anything like this is going to need the unanimous support of the Council of Europe, which includes the individual governments of each existing member state, as well as the majority of the EU Parliament. So it's still those just over 24 EU commissioners who have to be paying a careful attention to it, who have to have some oversight over it. Even though, yes, you will have officials who work day to day on that, the EU Commission drives all of this, and that's a limited number of, quite a small number of politicians.
Oh God, that sounds so undemocratic. I might become a leaver. I'm joking, by the way.
But I think all campaigners now, pro-EU, pro-democracy, really have to start really talking about proportional representation and pushing on that, Make Votes Matter Alliance. I mean, it's already there, it exists, and I think we should be getting behind that.
Well, that's the thing. If you've got a stable majority who think we should join the EU, it does become more complicated when you look at polling that says, if we had to adopt the euro, all of a sudden it's not quite such a majority, but it's still a plurality. It's still more, well, it varies a bit, but there's certainly a majority of people who think that if it could be made easy, shall we say, that we should join the EU. And then over time, if you can make those moves, we can have a more grown-up discussion about it. But the majority opinion doesn't matter in a first-past-the-post system. What matters is literally 1% of voters in the right places who are prepared to swing between the two candidates in those places who can realistically win. In fact, in the latest election, this last election, it swung from a large Conservative majority to a massive Labour majority. And the number of people who determined that was less than 1% of and that's not just 1% of the voters, 1% of those who voted, and it was already a smaller turnout. So it was fewer than 1% of all of it. If you could have just flipped their vote in those key places, we wouldn't have had this large Labour majority. We would have stayed with a Conservative majority. That's how few people matter. So opinion polls on what the majority of the public think in terms of elections makes no difference. But if we had proportional representation, there has never been a majority of people in an election voted for a hard Brexit, certainly, or indeed any Brexit. So you've got, you'd actually drive change towards joining the EU more quickly, because then, although the Conservatives can carry on if they want, saying, no, we're a hard Brexit party, because they wouldn't, because actually, under a proportional representation system, they would have to change. They'd have to change their tune. But at that point, it becomes the case that we can confidently say, well, there's not going to be a government emerge under PR that would support this continued hard Brexit. So electoral reform, if it could come first, would more quickly move us.
Yeah, agree.
You have PR in Spain, don't you, Lisa?
Yeah, I think the vast majority of European countries have a form of proportional representation. So, like, we're very used to it. I mean, we've had so many elections over the past few years here in Spain. Last year was a snap election, very similar to what Macron did after local elections put far-right Vox, given quite a lot of seats. So we're very used to having coalition governments where you have 2 or 3 parties, sometimes 4, 5, 6 smaller parties working together to form that government. And it's harder to get things done, some people say, but I think those are the countries that are not used to that form of coalition government and working together. But what it tends to do is it brings politics more to the centre, because you have to compromise, and you never have a population that's hugely far right or hugely far left. You will have those parties. I mean, like we know, we'd probably have about 90-something Reform MPs in Westminster just now if we've had PR. But still, they wouldn't, even with the Tories, they wouldn't have been able to form a government. It would have been Labour, Lib Dems and Green. Of course, Greens and Lib Dems are hugely pro-EU. They would have been far more of a position to push towards rejoining sooner, and probably Labour as well, because the way the MPs would have been voted in under PR, they probably would have followed in. So in that respect, it will take a bit of getting used to. The Tories don't want that. They don't want to, I mean, probably Labour as well. They don't want to compromise and have to listen to other parties, but it's the right thing to do. And even if these people at the far right had these MPs in Parliament, it's just they would have representation no matter how we feel about that. But I also think they tend to be so bad, so corrupt, so immoral that they would also expose themselves much more quickly, like they have now with Farage and Tice being MPs. They're a lot more open to scrutiny, and we see a lot more, and they have to be held to account more. So, yeah, it's I think Britain's got to go down that route before we can see anything.
There's another argument as well, so the arguments for me are essentially about fairness and about being representative. But there's another argument, it's actually been written about in the Telegraph of all places, in that for first past the post to even work mechanically, you essentially basically need 2 choices. It doesn't work otherwise. So in America, where they have first past the post, it's still unfair, it's still unrepresentative, but it still sort of works because you have basically 2 choices. But here, we don't. And in fact, the share of if you add up the share of the vote that Labour plus Conservatives together have had over time, over my lifetime, has declined. There's been times when it's spiked up due to various things, but it's declined overall to the point where at the last election, it was only just over 50%. So only a little over half of people voted either Labour or the Conservative. Now, at that point, first past the post mechanically breaks down in terms of providing stable governments, because it means that people aren't always seeing it as a binary choice anymore. People start to believe that other parties can win those elections, so they increasingly vote for them. And also, we could say that if we look at stable governments before the current one, I mean, we still have to give it time. I think it probably will be stable, but we'll give it time. But before that, the last stable government was literally the 2010 to 2015 coalition government, which was delivered under first past the post, but could just as easily have been delivered under PR. It was a coalition government, and it was the last stable government. What happened after it? 2015 to 2017, David Cameron, who'd been this stable prime minister, all of a sudden had to run screaming from the building very quickly because he'd unleashed this Brexit he didn't want to deal with. Then Theresa May called an election. She lost that majority. Then she had a situation where she couldn't even get her own MPs to vote for the party's single flagship policy. So there were record defeats for the government time after time. So that was hugely unstable. Then we had a majority Conservative government. Oh, that should be stable now. They burned through 3 prime ministers inside a single term. So the governments, and none of those governments could have emerged with any system other than first past the post. David Cameron wouldn't have had that slender majority in 2015 if it was proportional representation. Theresa May wouldn't have had anything close to even forming as minority government with PR in 2017. And in 2019, You wouldn't have had a hard Brexit government that could have taken us out of the EU. None of these things could have happened other than first past the post. And they were all deeply unstable governments that emerged from those. So, and part of that, as I say, is the fact that it isn't this simple choice of you vote for either Labour or the Conservatives. There's a lot more people seeing that actually that's not the case, which destabilises it. It creates a huge level of instability in the system. So first past the post can deliver stable governments. It's not representative and it's not good, but it can deliver stable governments if you've basically got a choice of two. Like in America, it's a rubbish system. It's not fair. It doesn't represent people, but it is stable. But in this country, it's increasingly less stable because we went from a position, the first general election of my lifetime, which I was far too young to vote in, it was about 85% or something voted for either Labour or the Conservatives. And now we've gone to a position where it's like 55.
So we need change. We need change there.
Yeah. I think I was going to ask something and I forgot now. So what are you going to say, Liz?
I just thought we could move on maybe to discuss something else.
I'll be boring, yeah?
No, darling. PR, so the PR of the Brexit, I just thought we could touch on the riots before we kind of move forward. And since time's getting a little tight, it's been pretty crazy times, hasn't it? Very upsetting to watch. Find it very difficult to watch from this side of the European continent, I've got to say, especially when it just felt like it's been manufactured and nurtured for years and years and years. And I think that's the most upsetting part of it, that people don't see that it's been manufactured for years and years and years. It does seem to have calmed down fairly quickly, which is a good thing. We thought we were in for a summer maybe of rioting. How do we feel about Keir Starmer and the government's stand on this and what's happened?
If there was going to be there's lots of emergencies that the Labour government were anticipating. This was an unexpected one. If there was going to be an unexpected emergency, then a repeat of something that happened in 2011 that he took charge of was probably the easiest one for him to deal with. And he dealt with it in the same way. And he said he believes that what quelled them in 2011 was this fast track system to get rioters, sentenced. And when you get that news out, then people think, well, it's not really worth me. I don't really want to go to prison just for nicking some ice cream, which literally happened to someone. So then it stopped. And the same thing happened here. There's any number of things that happened on that, like last Wednesday, which was supposed to be the big push and that never happened from the far right. And yet it is very likely that because, there are some hardened nutters that were at the forefront of this, but most of the people in it were like ordinary people. They've got a job, they've got a family, they've got a home life. And, someone like that, if you just say to them, is it really worth going to prison for a year or two just to push a wheelie bin at some police officers? They will say no, and they have said no. So what's ultimately happened is the large numbers of people who turned up just to cause trouble have decided it's not worth going to prison. And that was very much, that was driven by Keir Starmer. So from that point of view, I would say, yes, that's been dealt with well. There have been people criticise, Tom Tugan had to criticise, I would have stopped the riots much more quickly. But he hasn't said how. None of them have actually said what they should have done differently. The only people saying they should have done anything differently are people like Nigel Farage saying, you should have listened to these thugs instead.
Should have brought them into number 10 and had a
conversation. Their troubled brows and listened to their concerns. Which is, of course, an absolute nonsense. So there hasn't actually been anyone, as far as I can tell, say what should have been done differently. Now, that's just the first bit. That is like putting a stop to them. There's lots of things that now have to happen to make sure that they don't happen in the future. We know that a lot of resentment has been bred by poor living standards, whether it's anti-immigration sentiment, whether it's or whatever it is that caused people to go out and cause trouble. And, we know that Labour, Keir Starmer before the election had said the way we need to beat people like Nigel Farage and his brand of populism is by making people's lives better. So they've pushed ahead with their policies on housing and other infrastructure projects. Workers, the workers deal going through, that's supposed to improve people's pay. Obviously, there's going to be above inflation pay awards for public sector workers this year, and that should hopefully continue as well. It's certainly done to the last government. I see no reason, last Labour government, I don't see why it wouldn't now. But then there are other things that need to be done as well. They've talked about reviewing the Online Safety Act, but I mean, it's not an easy thing to deal with social media companies, particularly if a certain one is run by a certified lunatic, when they're based abroad. So I think probably they're talking about an international response there. But there are other things we need to do homegrown. So the riots sprang up very quickly. It was very well organised. There was a lot of planning for this. They didn't necessarily plan it for that specific time, but there was a lot of planning for this, a lot of infrastructure in place. Where's it being funded from? So, they need to investigate where the money has been coming from this. Who are the people involved? It's all right sending to prison the people who were stupid enough to be filmed breaking the law, but what about the people who were sat safely at home or maybe in Cyprus, who were organising it all?
Yeah.
How about them?
Yeah.
So Labour, for me, will ultimately, be judged not on what they've done to put out the immediate fire, but what they've done to make sure the arsonists don't come back.
It's heartbreaking, though, isn't it? Because how do we detoxify all of this language that's happened? So, like Peter knows, I found out today a relative of mine has been arrested and charged for incitement online, and I come from the Rhondda Valleys, left behind area, quite deprived, stuff like that. We're 98% white. And yet these people, a lot of people there blame migrants for their problems. And it's just they've been gaslit, obviously, for years and years and years by this drip, drip, drip fed narrative. And I just feel we've kind of radicalized almost a new generation, through this. It's how do we combat that? How do we take a step back from that? How do we stop it? Do you think it's impossible?
Well, I think it's to what Phil was basically getting at there was a lot of people blame immigration because of low living standards in their own lives. I think that's what led to Brexit as well. And then they put austerity on top of it just to make everything a million times worse, and then said, oh, that's the EU's fault. Let's have a referendum. Like, no, what are you doing? But I think that's how to do it. And if Labour genuinely mean what they say when it comes to housing and living standards and wages and stuff like that, then it might just on its own, the rhetoric about immigration come down. It might on its own, the rhetoric about the EU and everything come down on its own. In a way, like Brexit has kind of shown itself to be an absolute shit show all on its own, almost about, and people blame Remainers. Remainers haven't had to do anything. We just sit back and watch what we knew was going to happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there will be another side to it as well. So for some people, it's absolutely the case because, when you talk to people about, so what's your problem with immigration then? It's all about this, well, we're sharing our resources. They don't realise that immigrants bring the supply. They only see the demand side of it. So it's literally like, well, we're sharing our resources without them realising that actually they're supplying a lot of those resources. But specific complaints, what are the complaints? Oh, well, taking up too many houses. Well, if everyone can access decent housing, then and I'm not saying that's going to happen very quickly over the next few years, but if you can even ease that, you reduce the number of people who have that argument. If the argument is about strain on the NHS, if you reduce that strain, you reduce the number of people who perceive that as an argument. If it's about jobs, if you increase the pay and the conditions of people in work, which again, Labour's got policies for, then you don't eliminate it, but you reduce the number of people who will come up with that argument. So it's about reducing the number of people that argument to get down to a sweet spot of the population that electorally then means that you don't have to push such silly policies or rhetoric. But you still have to come from another way. I've no confidence it'll happen, but we need to look at the media as well. we've had a situation where even the BBC, the state broadcaster, will platform Brexiteers and let them tell objective lies. I would straight away bring in a media reform that says I would look at what they're doing with water companies at the moment. I think can work for so many things. They're going to make executives of water companies criminally responsible for illegal dumping. So all of a sudden it's not, at the moment it's about the fines and things like that. But when they've passed the legislation, they're going to be making the executive, the actual people who make the decisions, not some nameless corporation, the people who make the decisions, criminally responsible for discharges. And you could do that in the media. If you made presenters and journalists and producers criminally responsible for misinformation going out on their programs, you would suddenly see a lot. For a start, you wouldn't bother platforming people who are just going to tell shameless lies because it's not worth it. You're going to be, if you're going to be criminally held responsible. But you certainly, if someone comes on, like it might be an MP, and says something that's untrue, you will definitely counter it and you will definitely edit that program to make it clear what they have said is untrue. If I was to bring in one media reform, that would be it. And I think overnight you would see a massive difference. Make the individuals, instead of corporations, no fining corporations, make the individuals who make those conscious decisions criminally responsible for misinformation in the media.
I think that's a good idea. I think we can use technology as well. I can see, for example, AI listening to whoever's speaking live on the mic, and fact checking it, and then putting a fact check on probably 30 seconds it might take it to just put the actual fact on the screen as they're talking. That would be another way to counter it, so that if they know they're on the mic and they're talking, they know that people watching them can see a big thing on the bottom saying he's talking bollocks.
It'd be easy just to say, for a start, I would have no confidence in AI doing that accurately.
Well,
you
not,
could easily
not
just
yet,
say it wouldn't. Not yet, no. But no, I think it could be done. The producers of these programs know that what that person is saying is a lie. Sometimes, they might be telling a brand new lie which hasn't already been debunked. But the number of times that certain politicians have told lies that have been categorically debunked. And the people who produce those shows aren't idiots. They're not being hoodwinked. They know full well and they're allowing it. And I would just say make them criminally responsible for the accuracy of the information within reason. No one's saying you can't make a mistake, but if you're getting someone who's telling, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine actually with my Nigel Farage coming on every day, every week, and he can tell a brand new lie. If he can come up with an original lie, not a problem, because then as long as you stop him saying it twice. Because then immediately he tells this brand new lie that he's never told before. Immediately there'll be loads of experts saying this is a lie for this reason. The evidence comes out, and the very next program he's on, because I'm saying let them get away with it. He's told a brand new lie. We could sort of say, oh, Laura Kunzberg, she's a bit dim, she didn't know. Okay, fair enough. So, but the next time he's on any program, because it will have been so roundly debunked, you could say to those producers, if you let him say the same lie again, you will be deliberately allowing misinformation on your channel or your outlet, and you will find yourself with a knock on the door from the police. I would make it as clear as that. I would make it initially I wouldn't say just throw you in prison. I wouldn't go mad, but I would say there'd be a fine. I would say no, you can have escalation. You can have for a first offence a fine, and then maybe a larger fine, and then 3-strike rule. If you won't behave yourself, off you go. We've cleared up some prison space now.
Well, it's the same thing with balance, isn't it? It was Emily Maitlis who said when she was with the BBC, and they used to take 5 minutes to find 60 economic experts or whatever on the effects of Brexit, and then it would take them hours and hours to find one person for balance. That's, it's
normally Patrick
and then
Minford.
Put one of each on.
You don't need an expert to say the Earth is flat, to take it to the balance of the Earth is not flat.
That's how they could counter that, Phil, isn't it? If they find 60 saying Brexit's crap and one saying it's great, just put all 60 of them on with the one person.
In that situation, what you should be saying is actually opinion is not evenly divided. You could even just get away with having 5 of the one saying Brexit rubbish to the one that says it's not. something like that. But you can't just present one of each, because that presents this view that opinion is split, and it's not. And also, they shouldn't be putting people on as independent experts when they're neither independent nor expert. When you've got, the likes of these people from the IEA, and they're put on as an independent economics expert or an independent economist when they're neither. Yeah, things like that. That is misinformation. Well, it's actually disinformation, because they're doing it deliberately. They know what they're doing.
I would like to see some legislation around think tanks as well. Transparency, funding, things like that. I mean, that has to happen, because think tanks have had far too much of a negative effect on government and policy over the past few years as well.
So if Starmer does everything we want, we've got PR now. We can make sure the Tories are never going to get back. We've just had a referendum, and it was 81% for Rejoin. What year do you think we'll be celebrating that, Phil?
I mean, we know these things can take like 10 years. But one of the good things, actually, about what Labour are doing is, if they get that, I don't know whether they're going to get the agreements they want, and I don't know how quickly they will. But one of the good things is, because what a lot of the agreements want breaks down trade barriers, it is already preparing the way for us, because a lot of the accession talks will be about what we agree to. I mean, we could just do what Boris Johnson did, agree to everything. Obviously we have to follow the rules of the single market, we know that. But there are still areas of negotiation, like, for example, the euro. What I would say is, the way we should handle the referendum, we should actually say from the start there'll be two. That's what we should have done the last time. We'll say the first referendum is just permission to begin talks with a view to join the EU, but you do not give us a mandate to join the EU for that, and we'll put it in the same piece of legislation, and it'll be explicit in the question that is given to people. This is not a mandate to join the EU, just to discuss the terms of joining. And there will be, if it's successful, there will be a second referendum once the terms have been agreed between the UK government and the EU Commission. There'll be a second referendum to ask if people agree, at which point it can then go ahead. That's how it should be done, because then that gives you the option of saying, yes, it is normally a condition that we have to join the euro, but we would seek to negotiate that. Do you still give us permission? At which case you're much more likely to get a positive referendum result. And then, but, with the deals we're getting, we're already sort of moving closer anyway, because another is how quickly all the infrastructure in place to be able to manage our place in the single market and customs union. One of the reasons why it would be taking Moldova such a long time and Ukraine such a long time is the political as well as trade alignment is going to take longer. Whereas if we've already moved a long way towards it, because people might think, well, we're in the EU recently. It's like, yeah, but we had a lot of opt-outs, and also we've diverged a lot since then. So there's a lot of work to do. I
can tell you now, in my brain then was, we've only just left, why we've got so much to do, but it makes sense what you're saying. You're right, yeah.
So it might actually be quick. It's just it could be one of those things where it takes us a very long time to get to the point where we start the accession talks, but then when we do, maybe they don't take as long. But I mean, we'll be such a unique case, because you can't base it on past accessions, because everyone else started from a position of being quite far away and having to have those talks and move closer at the same time, whereas we may have already moved quite close already, and we're a member who left, and it's all really weird. But I would like to think that we could have rejoined before I retire. Although I don't know, is retirement a thing for YouTubers? I don't know. Maybe you just have to keep going until you die.
You do. You have to die on a live stream.
I don't think Labour are going to cross the red lines at all. Particularly,
well, not this Parliament. Definitely.
No, in this Parliament, no way. But we could possibly push them for PR by the end of this term, and then if they put the PR in place by the next Parliament, we could start, I think, to move forward towards more of a position of rejoining. So.
And on the bombshell that you've told us, we'll have to do at least another 13 of these bloody marches before we're back in the EU. I'd like to quickly announce that for anyone watching who don't know yet, is National Rejoin March 3 is happening on Saturday, the 28th of September 2024 in London. Go to the website marchforrejoin.co.uk for details. Coaches being organised to get you down there cheap, and it's going to be a really good day. Let's make it the biggest ever. Lisa, do you want to finish the podcast?
Yep. Thanks for listening, guys. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. And a huge thank you to Phil. Thanks so much, Phil, for joining us and sharing your wonderful knowledge with us. Thanks very much.
Yeah, we're big fans. Don't stop ever. Cheers, Phil.
Rejoin.